Hello and welcome to part 2 of the winter build series. Now this is the first time tuning in. This is a new series focusing on the progress of the rebuild of my RB26 using forged internals, as well as the conversion from a twin to a single turbo. Now in part 1 we just did an overview of the parts that are going to be used throughout the build. In part 2 and going forward we're going to focus on the disassembly of the long block to get the short block ready for the machine shop and those forged goodies. So please follow along. We're going to be going step by step as we tear this block down. So like I said, this series is going to be following the teardown and rebuild of the RB26. So in part 2, we're going to focus on the exhaust side. We're going to remove both the front and the rear turbo, take off the inlet and the outlet pipes, and do a bit of an inspection on the turbos. Like I said, they've been taken off at least one time before, so fingers crossed when they did that, they rebuilt these with some steel internals. In part 3, we're going to be focusing on the intake side, so removing the collector, the throttle chamber, the manifold assembly, as well as getting that lovely rat's nest of vacuum and coolant lines. Part 4, we're going to focus on removing the timing components, as well as getting the head removed from the block. And then in part 5, we're going to look at removing any last bits from the short block and doing a bit of an inspection before it goes off to the machine shop. Now the engine is out of the car, so there's going to be some steps that you're going to have to do that I'm not going to be able to show you, but we'll cover those when we get into the instructions. Now what this is going to be able to provide is a close-up and better view of some of those bolts and clips you're going to have to deal with when you're taking on some of these projects. So before we get started, I just wanted to share a little bit of the garage makeover that we've been working on that I'm super stoked about. That's my little media center here over by my workbench. So I got the laptop hooked up for any WTF Google moments. I got the big screen up there, so stream that Xfinity, watch some movies. In this case, we're going to be following the service manual, so any torque specs, any sequences that I call out, and generally the overall standard work of disassembly, we're going to be following the OEM manual. I have my space heater up there, got a heater on the other side of the garage, so it keeps everything real nice and toasty. Also installed 12 4-foot long LED lights throughout the garage, which really make it seem like daylight in here. And I mean, working on the car and just doing projects in general is literally like night and day compared to the dingy yellow bulbs that were in here before. Now before we get to the disassembly, let's go over some of the general anatomy of our turbochargers so we understand the parts better as we go to take them off. So here's our front turbo, here's our rear turbo. Front turbo obviously powered by cylinder 1, 2, and 3. Rear turbo powered by cylinders 4, 5, and 6. Looking at the front of the turbos, you can see the compressor housing, followed by the air inlet tube. Your intake is basically coming in this section here. This part goes to your stock recirculating valves. Here's your air inlet, which goes to the outlet pipe that feeds into your front mount intercooler. You can see your wastegate actuator. As you can tell, my wastegate line has been changed, so another indicator that the turbos have been taken off, possibly serviced. Who knows, maybe there's some steel internals in there. Looking at the rear of the turbo, you have your exhaust outlet as well as your O2 sensor. You can see where that wastegate actuator arm comes down to control the swing valve that opens and closes inside of your exhaust housing. In the middle here is your center housing. This contains your bearings as well as your rotor shaft, which connects both the turbine and the compressor wheels. You're also going to have various lines coming in and out of this housing. This is for your cooling purposes. Not only do you have your coolant feed and return, but you're also going to have an oil feed and return. Speaking of those lines, you can see a network of them right on top of the turbos. Here you have your coolant flow line. This picks up that hot coolant coming out of the turbos, flushes it back around the front of the motor to your upper outlet, which goes back into your radiator to be cooled back down. You have your vacuum tubes right here. This is your wastegate signal, which again goes back around to the intake side of your motor. You take a peek underneath the turbos, you can see the oil drain lines, which go back into the lower portion of the block and eventually drain back into the sump. And you can see those hard lines, which are your coolant and your oil feed, which comes straight from the block. Now, if your engine is still in the vehicle, there's a couple of things that you're going to have to do as well as remove before we can start working on the turbo. So first off, make sure you drain the coolant, both from the radiator as well as from the block. Now, on top of draining your radiator, you're also going to want to look right underneath that rear turbo. Towards the back of the block, you're going to see a 12mm bolt. That is the water drain bolt for the block. So you want to make sure that we go ahead and get that coolant out now, because if we bust off one of those lines, and we're not expecting it, we're going to get wet. You're going to have to remove your intakes, the MAF housings, all the plumbing for your inlet as well as your recirculation. you have to remove your outlet pipes. I'll put a link in the description to one of my other videos. I talk about taking that apart. And you're also going to have to take off your front mount intercooler piping that outlet pipe feeds into. Also recommend taking off your exhaust valve cover. You do gain some more working room when you do that. And on the exhaust side, we just have to remove our downpipe as well as disconnect our front and our rear O2 sensor. So now that the coolant's been drained and the parts have been removed, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to focus on the two lines coming out right above the turbo here. This is for our coolant and this is for our vacuum line for our wastegates. So at this junction, you can see two flare nuts. This is going to be your line A, this is going to be your line B. So our first step is going to be to loosen both of these nuts, and then we're going to go ahead and detach tube A. To do this, we're going to need both a 12mm as well as a 17mm. Alright, now that both of these flare nuts have been loosened, let's go ahead and remove the bolt and detach tube A. Looking at this bottom junction, you have two different lines here. Line C is for your front turbo, line D is for your rear turbo. We're going to go ahead and loosen both of these flare nuts, again using our 17mm. Now we're going to go ahead and finish off removing that flare nut from hose B and go ahead and get this pulled out of the junction. Now in order to be able to remove these lines, there's two bolts that we have to remove. One is a 10mm bolt right here, and the other one's a 12mm bolt that holds the bracket to the head down over here. If I go ahead and remove the wiring for the O2 sensor, we'll be able to see it a little bit better here. There you go. For the 12mm, you're going to have to use a short 12 on a little bit of a swivel and an extension to get in past that inlet elbow right here. With those bolts removed, we could go ahead and start detaching all these tubes. In order to separate our wastegate vacuum tube, we're going to go ahead and remove the clamps and the line from both the wastegate actuators, and then you're going to see one more 10mm bolt right underneath this bracket here. To finish removing tubes C and D, we just need to remove the fastener that goes into the center housing of each turbo, and this is a 17mm. Now that those lines are out of the way, we can go ahead and remove the oil and the coolant feed lines. So there's two different eye bolts that we have to remove. One is a 17mm and the other one is a 19. We're going to be focusing on the front turbo first. As you can see, there's still a little bit of coolant dripping out of those lines. So you can imagine what it would be like if we popped that off without draining the fluid out of the block first. It would definitely turn into a giant mess. Now, the manual shows that there's a ground wire connected to our front turbo manifold cover. I do not have that, obviously. So Again, somebody took these out, they put it back in, and what happened to that ground wire, who knows. So you have three 10mm bolts holding the covers onto the manifold. One of each of mine has been broken off. This one looks like it's cross-threaded because it's pretty stuck, but you can still see a gap there. And well, I got one guy holding it down for the fourth. So we're gonna go ahead and pull those three 10mm bolts off. Now we should be able to just lift that cover right off. And there's our manifold. All right, now we're gonna go underneath the turbo, and this is where it'll get interesting if it's still in the car. I mean, obviously you could get a straight shot from the bottom, but there's two 12mm bolts on either side of this oil return line that goes back to the block and then down into the sump. So you can see one of the 12mm bolts right there. You could use a short one on a swivel plus an extension to get to that guy. The one that's on the back side, however, you're better off using a long 12 on a much longer, just straight extension, no need for a swivel to get that one. So we're going to go ahead and pop both of those two bolts off and pull that oil return line out. Now we can go ahead and pull this return line down and out of the way. There we go. If you look right in front of the exhaust outlet, you're going to see a bracket that holds the turbo to the block. We're going to have to remove these three bolts. The top and the bottom one are both going to be a 12mm, and the one in the middle is going to be a 10mm. And lastly, we just have the four nuts that are securing the studs from the turbo to the exhaust housing themselves. So we're gonna have to probably remove this front part of the inlet just to gain some more room to remove the nut on this side. And I'm probably gonna have to remove the inlet for the rear turbo to get some more room to remove the nuts on that side as well. Also, you'll notice that there's these little locking finger brackets around the nuts. And this is to prevent those nuts from becoming loose or backing off, but you could tell that mine have been spread out already. So again, another indicator that these turbos have already been off at least once. So go ahead and just take a nice big screwdriver and start working those tabs out. Now the manual doesn't show this, but if you still have your engine in the car and your car is still retaining the AC system, you're going to want to remove this front inlet from the compressor housing cover. Otherwise, when you go to drop the turbo down, you're going to run into some interference and it's not going to have enough clearance to get out of the way. In order to remove the cover, you're going to have two Allen head bolts on either side there. While we're at it, let's go ahead and remove the rear inlet going to the compressor housing as well. Again, it's just going to buy us some more space. All right, front turbo is ready to drop out. We're just going to pull it straight down and then we should be able to swing it up and out of the way. we go. The last thing that we have to do for the front turbo is remove the manifold. So there's 2 pair of bolts per cylinder. So there's 2 right here, 2 in the middle, and then 2 for cylinder 3. They're 12mm bolts. There is a sequence that we have to follow to remove it in order to prevent warping. So as far as the removal sequence, it's going to be top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, top middle, bottom middle. Okay, so 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Okay, so that's the removal sequence. With the front turbo removed, the rear turbo is going to come off quite a bit quicker. Because we've already done that pre-work of removing those coolant lines, the eye bolts for the oil and the coolant feed, now all we have to do is start focusing on this bracket here. So we're going to go ahead and remove these 2 12mm bolts to go ahead and remove that bracket from the head. Now, in order to remove that bracket and the coolant and vacuum line, we're going to have to remove this 10mm bolt. Now, just to show you where we're at, we're working on the intake side of the motor. Okay, so that back right corner, there's that 10mm bolt. So we're going to have to go ahead and remove this guy real quick. With that bolt removed, now we can go ahead and work this bracket off the studs. Best way, just go ahead and grab yourself a screwdriver and just kind of give yourself some leverage and pop it off. All right, now we have access to the bolts for our manifold cover. There should be 3. In my case, I only have 2. That one's broken off. Again, these are 10mm bolts. And we could just go ahead and remove the cover. Working back on the bottom side of the turbo, we're going to have to remove the 2 12mm bolts that hold the oil return line to the block. And then we're going to have to remove the 3 bolts on the bracket that hold the turbo to the block. So again, the top and the bottom bolt on the bracket are both 12mm, and the middle one is going to be a 10mm. Just like before, we have the 4 nuts that go to the studs from the turbo, and these little brackets with the locking fingers. Again, you can see that some of mine have already been flattened. Go ahead and take a screwdriver and pry those out of the way. And now for the 13mm nuts. Again, before you go ahead and remove that last nut, make sure that you're supporting the turbo from the bottom. Go ahead and make sure that these lines are also out of the way so it doesn't get caught up on it. I'll go ahead and just lower the turbo down. So the last thing we have to do for the rear turbo, again, is just remove that manifold. 2 sets of bolts per cylinder. There is a sequence, so it's going to be top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, top middle, bottom middle. Okay, so 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Alright, now just pull the manifold right off. So there you go, removal of the front and the rear turbo. With them being removed, let's go ahead and look so we can see the feed for our oil with the T going to the front and the rear turbo, and then the feed for the water lines, again going to the front and the rear turbo. Here's where that rear turbo oil drain was. Here's that front oil drain. So we'll go ahead and start stripping down the turbos, and let's see what we got. Alright guys, now that the turbos are off, now we could take a look at whether or not when they removed them the last time, they were just replacing some gaskets, maybe doing a service, or whether or not they upgrade the internals. So fingers crossed I find some steel internals. If not, oh well. So first thing we have to do, we have to remove this exhaust housing. There's a series of 13mm nuts going all the way around. So I'm going to go ahead and pull that off, and we can get a good look at the turbine. So it looks like when they removed this the first time, maybe they lost one of the nuts and they replaced it, and this one's actually a 14mm. Alright, let's go ahead and take a look. What I want to see is a dark colored wheel, covered with carbon, more indicating it's a steel wheel. If it's white or powdery, then it's going to be a ceramic wheel. Well, after cleaning up these blades, what color do you see? I see white. So it's still a ceramic turbine, so I guess no good news there as far as being upgraded turbo. On the front turbo, it looks like I have a mix of 12mm and 13mm bolts. So I don't know why they were popping everything off. I mean, I'm guessing maybe they just replaced the gaskets. Yeah, just regular maintenance, I guess. So let's go ahead and pop these nuts off, and we'll take a look at the front turbo. Need to remove this 10mm as well. Alright, let's see what sort of turbine the front turbo has. Yep, still ceramic. Womp womp womp. Alright, so now that those front inlets are removed, we can get a better look at each turbo's compressor wheel. So just initial comparison, if we look at the rear turbo, you can see that the compressor wheel blades are much cleaner than the front ones. So we definitely have more of a buildup going on there on those front wheel blades. As far as shaft play is concerned, I don't have a dial gauge set up, so this is just kind of going to be a estimation with my calibrated eye. Now looking at the manual, it says shaft play between 0.056 and 0.127 mil. Obviously my fingers are not that accurate, so we're just going to give it some lateral side-to-side pressure and see how much movement is in that rotor shaft there. Alright, so you can see just a little bit of side-to-side play. check the in and out, so put a little bit of pressure, pushing down and pulling out on the shaft, and it's not really going anywhere. So a little bit of lateral movement on the rear turbo. Let's look at the front turbo now. So like we said, we could see definitely more of a buildup on those blades. So let's check as far as shaft play is concerned. So there definitely is a little bit more noticeable side-to-side movement on the front turbo rotor shaft. So we'll kind of check the in and out play as well. And no real movement going that way. So a little bit more side-to-side play compared to the rear turbo. So we'll flip the turbos over and take a look at the exhaust side. Now we already figured out that these are ceramic, not only because of the color of the blade, but you could also tell because of the style of the securing nut that's used. So you can see that this one almost looks like a multi-point Torx head bolt, whereas if I was to have a steel one, it's more of like a rotor, like an oblong triangle sort of looking one. So let's check the shaft play on the front turbine wheel there. So again, a little bit of side to side, right? We noticed that on the compressor housing. I'll push and pull a little bit, and no movement that way. Let's move on to the rear turbo. Again, ceramic. You can see that different style securing nut there. Check any lateral side to side movement. And much more minimal compared to the front turbo. And give a little pressure both in and out, and no removal. Another thing that I want to do while the turbos are out is take a look at the serial number for each turbo and see if we could determine whether or not these were the OEM turbos. Maybe they're from a 33 or a 34 model, but we'll go ahead and take these serial numbers, jump online, and see what we can find. Alright, so now in order to figure out where these turbos came from, let's jump onto Google and we will do a quick search here with that part number that we just pulled off. So it's 14411-24U04. Alright, well, initial results are showing an R32 GTR turbo. Let's jump into the forum here and post the same part number. So yeah, 1411224U04, saying standard R33 GTR turbos. Let's dig a little bit deeper here. So R33, RB26, and yeah, 14411-24U04. So I know the -24U00 would have been an N1 turbo, but it looks like these are just standard R33 GTR turbos. So I don't know whether the stock R32s blew previously, and then they sourced some R33s. Maybe they had some upgraded turbos and then they swapped it out before the car was sold. When I bought it, the car was pretty much stock. I mean, it just had basic intake, exhaust, and an HKS boost controller. So, not really sure on what sort of upgrades the previous owner had. Just kind of adds to the mystery. And maybe we'll figure out more as we dive more into the block. Alright guys, that's going to wrap it up for part 2. I hope you found this video helpful and informative as you guys tackle your own projects. It is the weekend of Christmas, so I hope everybody has a Merry Christmas, a Happy Holiday, and a very safe New Year. If you like this video and you want to see more, please follow the series, like, subscribe, share with your friends, and drop me a comment. I love interacting with you guys. So please stay tuned, and until part 3, have a good one.